listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by Hannah Gayhardt. She is our operations manager at True Native Media. Hannah, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Heather.
So, Hannah, you're a different guest. I would say you're a special guest because you do a lot of the editing for the podcast. And so it's fun. Is it interesting to be on the other side of the mic?
Yeah, it's a nice switch up.
Yeah,
I like to change things up. It's nice.
And you came from radio, so you're used to being behind a mic. How much were you behind the mic in radio?
Not too much. I was a producer for a little while, so I was on mic a lot more then, but I did all sorts of things when I was in radio. I was doing programming, promotions, different sorts of production. So I did a little bit of everything. So it was just a little bit of mic work.
Very cool. I'm excited to have you on the show. And you've been at True Native Media for several years now. And I'm curious what kind of led you to the podcast space.
Sure. So it all started in radio. So when I was working in radio, we started to cut up some of the different host segments and we would repackage that as podcasts. So that's how it really started. And then a lot of the hosts started to make their own podcasts on the side. So I was assisting them with the editing and the production. And then some of their friends had podcasts. So I started to work with them as well on producing and editing. So that's really where it started. And then once I left radio, I really did miss the podcast aspect of things. Mm-hmm. So I randomly found an opportunity to help out with an international news podcast, which is nothing I've ever been interested in or worked in, but I was like, okay, here's an opportunity. So I was behind the mic for that. I was recording their weekly news segments and I did some of their social media. And then eventually that became a paid position and it wasn't very much pay, but it was something. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, there's some opportunity here. This is really nice. And I thought I would be really, really happy in this industry. So that's exactly why I'm here today.
I love it. I remember when I was interviewing you, you said I volunteer to edit podcasts. And I was like, you do what? That's awesome.
Yeah. If you love something, you can always figure out how to volunteer.
It's true.
And make it into something. I've done it with many other things. It's great.
Yeah. So I haven't asked you this, but are you still editing that international podcast?
No. Oh my gosh. It was so much work. I couldn't keep up with this and that. It was way too much.
Yeah.
I stopped a little while ago.
Yeah. That's funny. So tell us a little bit about your role at True Native Media, because while you edit this podcast, that is, I would say, not even really your job here. We're just very lucky to have you on board doing that. But tell us a little bit about your role at True Native.
Sure. So I started as a delivery specialist. So a lot of what I do is delivery reporting, looking at all of the shows and seeing their numbers and looking at how things change and determining the different factors as to why a particular show performs a certain way. And then on top of understanding that for all of our shows, it's about communicating those certain things to our sales team and our clients so that they understand why something is performing a particular way. And if we need to make adjustments, whether that be a reforecast or even adding impressions to a campaign or whatever it may be, right? Mm-hmm. Because shows are changing constantly. So we're always looking at the numbers and we're always checking on campaign performance. So I'm involved a lot in that. On top of that, I do a lot of the managing of campaign orders in the different hosting platforms, mainly Megaphone. So I have my hand in that constantly, making sure that things are created and go live. And aside from that, I don't know, I've done a lot of different things. It's mainly campaign management, like the material things and making sure everyone has what they need. Yeah.
What I think is so fascinating about this industry, and I think you could take this perspective from many different angles, but it's complicated. And sometimes I love the industry so much, and sometimes I just wonder why it has to be so complicated. But the nature of the independence of podcasting is really what makes it more of a complicated matter because it isn't like we have just one show or that we have just even one category of hosts. It's like there's so much, right? There are so many different shows, so many different genres, so many different hosts, and so many different approaches to do the way that we're doing things. And things are constantly changing, right? And while while the changes are often good, they can be complicated. And while we've got some great tools that we use, there still are a lot of gaps in the tools and really just to create a streamlined process. And so I know a lot of what you do here at True Native Media is take all of those bits and pieces to make a successful campaign, which really isn't an easy thing to do.
It's so true. It's funny you say that. First of all, I fully agree. Podcasting is ever changing. Things are always being updated, expectations are always changing. It's so nuanced, but that's what I love about podcasting. It the freedom that you have from that is it's so great, and to be able to improve things
Mhm.
or to see how something just to see how it could possibly be better, it's great to have that flexibility. It's so funny because in the times that I've helped out with training some of our operations department, one of the first things I tell them is, okay, you're going to hear me say the word nuance a lot, a lot, a lot. You're going to get tired of it, but that is, it's everywhere. Nuance is
Mhm.
everywhere. And that's what keeps us so busy. So it's not a bad thing, but it is certainly a lot to keep up with. And that's a big part of the operations team as well. It's just keeping up with all of those never-ending changes.
Right, right, for sure. So James Cridlin wrote an article just a couple weeks ago about the metrics and the numbers in the podcasting space. And I really need to get him on the show to go over that article. I was intending to do a solo article to break down what he said and talk through it, but it was so complicated even for me. And I was like, I think I need to get him on the show just to talk about it because the numbers in podcasting are really, really complicated, and the reason that they're complicated is because it is looking at what exactly is that number and what does that represent and where does that number come from, and we at True Native Media are hosting provider agnostic, which means that we work with a variety of different hosting platforms for shows. The primary company we work with is Megaphone, so we know that platform inside and out, but we look at other platforms as well, and numbers can change. When we move a show from one hosting platform to another hosting platform, the numbers change, and that always really boggles my mind because I think if we're all IAB certified or compliant and we take a show that is here that is getting these sorts of numbers and put it in to another platform, because we should be playing by the same rules, those numbers should be the same, but they never are. And it's so interesting. And I would say that you're the person on our team who is the numbers expert because you spend so much time in these platforms. Number one, scheduling the campaigns and saying, hey, this campaign needs a certain number of impressions, but then also checking on it to make sure it's actually delivering those impressions. So, what would you say, like in looking at the numbers, is I guess just something that's important for people to keep in mind? Is it that they are always ever changing, or is it that maybe different layers that you put on a campaign are going to have a big impact? Like, what do you think that advertisers need to understand about the numbers when it comes to podcasting?
It's so many different factors. It's not just one straight answer. Like you said, the hosting platforms are one thing on their own. I wish that we
Mhm.
had more visibility on each and every Megaphone does a great job at it, but I wish that we did have more visibility on where shows exist and what streaming platforms are hosting these different shows because they are different across platforms
Mhm.
occasionally. Like you do see differences when people move to our Megaphone account, for example. I think that has a lot to do with some of the differences in downloads, I
Mhm.
think that a big thing that can change performance and can change the ideal amount of ads that are refreshed in a certain amount of time is how many times the shows are publishing episodes per week or per month.
Mhm.
That can be a big part of how things perform. How many ad locations do you have and where specifically are those ad locations? Do you have 3 mid-rolls back to back in every single episode, or do you have 3 mid-rolls that are spread out a little bit so that they're singular and your listeners aren't listening to this big, long ad break in the middle of your episode? And is that assisting with performance? There's so many different things in terms of the show downloads that I think can affect the overall performance of a campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it is so fascinating to see because it's also like you talked about, there are so many different factors, but then the numbers aren't static, right? They change all the time. And this year with the iOS 17 update, they've changed more than maybe in past years. We don't really want to talk about all those changes. But I mean, but there's still it's like, you know, a show might have a certain percentage of its audience in the US, well, then maybe all of a sudden something happens and they get a whole bunch of listeners in the UK, or maybe something happens here in the US and they get a higher percentage of US listenership, right? It's like it is something that is constantly changing. And so it can be really difficult to predict. So I always just think that that's important for us to look at. Now, you have listened to a lot of podcast ads. One of your jobs is to schedule the ads and make sure that the campaigns are live. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are. We work with about 200 different podcasts. And so you listen to a lot of different ads. Are there certain things that stand out to you about what really makes an ad strong, what makes it memorable, what's going to really get that ad to perform?
There are definitely a handful of things that create an especially successful ad, in my
Hmm.
opinion. So the first thing would be a really strong hook that preferably includes personal experience in some way, shape, or form. So a great example of that, actually yesterday, I was listening to an ad from Toddlers Made Easy.
Hmm.
So the host, Catherine, opened up with this really it's a really sweet story about she's a pediatrician. So she was talking about how one of her first infant patients recently came back to her with her grandchild. And it had
Wow.
been this, yeah, it had been this long line of their family members being her patients and how they came back to visit and they took a photo together and it's this great story. And then it leads into talking about the skincare brand and how she didn't love how she looked in the picture and all these different things. And it was like, oh, wow. She was like, I was sold. And I knew that I was listening to the ad. So just an example of a really great hook. It doesn't always have to be exactly about the product or the service that you're selling. It could be anything. Your listeners are there for you and they listen because they enjoy you. So the more
Mhm.
personal you can make the hook, especially, I think starting out with a strong hook is super important. And then that personal experience should continue throughout the advertisement,
Mhm.
right? And that includes a lot of different things. So one could be you need to talk about an issue that the product could solve, but you need to figure out how to talk about it in a personal way. What personal issue do you have that product is going to solve? And then you go on to talking about how it solved it, why you're happy with it. Again, your listeners are there for you and they want to know about your specific opinion. And it just makes listening to an ad a lot better when you include personal experience. So the other thing I would say about creating a successful ad is not including too many details about the product. And when I say that, I mean, so I'll give an example. If a show is advertising some sort of supplement, for example, I don't think it would be very beneficial to get into the science of the supplement, at least not too much,
Mhm.
because you're probably going to lose more listeners than if you were to say something more brief about the science of it, I guess, and include what specifically has changed about you because you were taking the supplement, right? So I personal experience really is the most important thing. I also think that reading the call to action more than once at the very end of the ad is always a must. You always
Mhm.
have to repeat that promo code and make sure that your audience understands the promotion and they know how to receive that promotion.
Right, right. No, absolutely. I love all of that. And I think that I like that you started with the hook because to me that's what makes people listen to the ad. If
Yeah.
you start out with, and I know some of our advertisers want you to say the call to action at the very beginning of the ad. And to me, I think that that does detract from the host's ability to really continue to keep their audience's attention when they're relaying a story. And I'm so glad you shared that because I think that that is such a personal that's such a good representation of using a personal story like Catherine did that really doesn't have anything to do with the product necessarily. At
Right.
least the story didn't, right? And so that I think is what keeps the listener engaged is like, oh, hey, this is a really interesting story. I'm going to continue to listen because I think that I always feel like there's two important perspectives. Number one, people want to be entertained, and I don't think people care if they're being entertained and sold at the same time. They just wanna be entertained, right? So if you're creating something that they wanna listen to, they're gonna listen to it. And then number 2, like, the person has to actually listen to the ad in order to take action. And if you can't figure out how to get them to listen to the ad and to your point, I think sometimes brands do it's like to me, features and benefits are like the ABCs of selling, right? Like
Mhm.
just giving somebody a features list isn't going to sell them on your product. And ultimately, especially if you're like a direct to consumer brand, what you're really trying to do is get that person to your website and then your website should be what's going to close the deal, right? It's like you're going to hear about the product, you're going to get the interest when you hear the ad as a listener, but then the purchase happens on the website. So really getting people to go to a place where they can actually purchase the product or take action, to me, that's the important part. And when you get them to your website, you've got all the space you need to list those features, and that consumer that wants the features can then consume the features, right?
100%.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is interesting is that you have a different perspective than many of the guests that I have on the show because we often are talking about the brands, right? We're talking about the advertisers, how to create a successful campaign, how to create something that is really going to be effective from an advertising perspective. But you deal with our podcasters. So while you talk to our advertisers as well, you have a unique perspective in talking to our podcasters. So I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think that maybe advertisers or brands are missing when it comes to communicating with podcasters? Is there something that they could do that would, from the podcaster's perspective, make it easier for the campaign to be successful?
That's a great question. There's certain things that some clients do that I think are so amazing and that I wish that everyone did. I think it really helps in order to understand a product on the podcaster side, aside from sending product samples, which if you're going to include personal experience, I always think that the client should provide product samples and updated product samples if you're continuing like on a monthly basis to provide advertisements, right? Depending on the product. But
Mhm.
there should always be product samples. But on top of that, I love it when we're able to provide podcasters with an onboarding doc that just lays out specifically which product they're advertising. I think it can be very helpful along with the talking points because as we just explained, the talking points aren't meant to be super, super brand specific and list out every single piece of information about the product, right? So the more that the podcaster can understand the product on the back end, I think the more successful the ad can be because they're just going to have better personal experience. The other thing that I think creates a better ad campaign is updating the talking points. So
Yeah.
let's say that we have a year long, let's say we have an annual campaign and we've only received one version of the talking points for the entire year. Well, the podcaster is going to be expected to update that ad on a monthly basis, but it really helps if we can receive more talking points in order to give them some more ideas, help them freshen up the ads, right? I think it's great when we receive them monthly, but even quarterly for an annual campaign, for example, I think is a huge help. So I think refreshing the talking points is really big. The other thing, just in general, that I think benefits the performance of the campaign is providing a promotional offer that isn't already existing on your website.
For sure.
So we've run into some campaigns where maybe the performance isn't as high as we expected, and we look at the podcast specific promotional offer and the promo code, and we go on the website and we do some digging, and the same exact promotional offer with a website, like a generic promo code, is popping up in 10 different places as soon as you get on the website. So I really think that making an offer specific to the show and being able to say to your audience, hey, this is a special offer. You're not going to get this anywhere else. I think that that goes a long way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. So let's just break down what you said. So, first, it's providing the host with more product information. And I love the idea that we're not asking for 5 pages of talking
No.
points, right? Like, we're at True Native, we primarily do 60-second ad reads. I know in the industry, you can certainly buy 30-second ad reads, 15, I'm sure. And even I've seen recently 90-second ad reads. So, I mean, I know that there's a variety of different lengths. And so talking points should be equivalent to the length of the ad, but just providing the host with more product information can be really helpful because part of what we're trying to do is say, like, hey, we want to educate you about this product. What is your opinion on the difference between sending like product information as opposed to doing like an onboarding call with the brand or with the podcast buying agency? What do you feel like there is one that's better than the other?
I think it's really dependent on the product.
Mm,
I think if it sometimes we run into cases where a particular product is very specific to someone.
hmm
It often happens with supplements.
Yeah.
So a lot of time when we have shows that are advertising a particular supplement, the brand will send them something depending on what they're looking for. And in that case, I do find that the onboarding calls are beneficial because it's extremely personalized. If you're advertising a clothing brand, for example, I don't think it's as specific. You know
Right.
what I mean? It doesn't it's just not necessary in every single case. I think that just a document with some additional information can be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I totally agree with that. Yeah. So, one of the things that you mentioned that I personally am mortified by is not refreshing talking points. Like, I find it absolutely crazy that we literally and we have experienced this, that's why you brought it up more than one time, where people place annual campaigns, they give us talking points in December for their January ad, and then those talking points are meant to run for the entire year. And I know that from the advertiser's perspective, because I've talked to companies about this, they'll say, well, there's nothing new that we would want to share with them. And my perspective on it is that if there's nothing new you want to share with the host, then there's nothing new that the host needs to share with the audience. And so your job as the brand or as the advertiser is to position your product in a way to the host so that they can position the product to their audience. You're the one that knows the product inside and out. You're the one that understands what the benefits of it are. And also, I get like there are some products, right? Like if we're talking maybe about a credit card processing company or even like a software company or something like that, like maybe things aren't going to change from month to month, right? It's like, hey,
Mhm.
this is the Chase credit card today and it's going to be the Chase credit card in 6 months or what have you, right? But the reality is that there's going to be some sort of a promotion or maybe there's some seasonality. Like, can you even send the host prompts, right? Like I love it when the copy will say things like, "Here are 3 or 4 prompts that you could pick from." Like, "Think about this as we're heading into the holiday season." Just I mean, just little things like that, I think go a long way in really making the host be able to connect with the brand and create a good ever-changing ad because nobody wants to hear the same ad constantly, right? And if we're not updating the talking points, then inevitably that's what happens.
Exactly, and the prompt example, that's a great point because it's a great way for the advertiser to test the performance as
Mhm,
well. You know who does it a lot, and they do it really well is BetterHelp. Like, all of their talking points have a theme, and it usually switches up seasonally, right?
mhm.
And personal experience is still going to be incorporated into those ads, but everyone still has the same theme, and I think it's really interesting to look at performance based on those changes in the talking points as well.
Yeah. That's such a great example because BetterHelp is BetterHelp, right? Therapy is
Mhm.
therapy. There's nothing that's special that's gonna happen in 3 months. It's still gonna
Right.
be therapy, right? I think that in a lot of ways, BetterHelp is a good company for brands and advertisers to watch to see what they're doing because they have experienced a lot of success with podcast ads, and so if you look at what they're doing and try to emulate it, I don't think that's a bad approach for sure. So you work with a lot of tools in the podcast space. So I feel like we're on this podcast, we're always saying, we need this tool, we need this functionality. I wish this did this, I wish that did that. If you, I guess, had a magic wand and you could either create a functionality in a platform that we already work on or create your own software from scratch, like what tools really need to exist that you don't see exist here?
I've been thinking about this for a while, and I really wish that we had visibility on like activity from attribution tracking platforms within the hosting platforms.
Oh.
That would be so amazing. Really to just track different types of performance
Uh-huh.
in one space. It would be great to receive just monthly reports or something like that with the impressions from the hosting provider, but also just the more in-depth information about their performance. So if purchases were the main goal of the campaign,
Mhm.
it would be great to see that next to all of the show's individual information right within the hosting platform so that you don't have to skip around because there's also so many different attribution tracking platforms. It's a lot of hopping around, and if we could just combine all of those forces and we
Right.
could see everything in the same spot, I think it would be really beneficial.
Right. That is such an interesting idea. What I find really fascinating, and I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of the importance of measurements and the tactics that we use and that you're seeing. But one of the things that I have been seeing more and more is layering of different pixels from advertisers. So they aren't just using one pixel, they're using multiple pixels. And if you're unfamiliar with attribution tracking or pixel tracking in the podcast space, I feel like the grandfather of all of them was really Pod Sites when they started, and then, of course, they were purchased by Spotify, and now is Spotify Ad Analytics. There was Claritas that has also been around for a really long time, and now it feels like we certainly are have more players. We've got Arts AI, we've got Podscribe, Magellan, of course, Veritonic, and I'm sure I'm missing some others as well, but there are lots of pixel tracking companies, and it would be really fascinating if in the hosting platform, you could go in and you could see, like, this is what we're tracking on the hosting platform. This is the performance we're seeing from a delivery perspective. And then if you had under that any of the installed pixels for that specific campaign, what their delivery looked like, as well as what their conversions look like, having all of
Mhm.
that in one place would be pretty cool.
Absolutely. And it would be so great to upload an ad and have it automatically transcribed. If you're tracking performance on an annual campaign and one month isn't performing as well as the previous month, for example, well, let's take a look at the advertisement and see if maybe that needs to be updated for some reason. It would be great to have like an automatic transcription as well as that other information, whether it be about geo-targeting or when the last time the ad was refreshed, which we can see on our end pretty easily, but it always helps to have that information in a report because then you can look at one particular show and look at patterns
Mhm.
across long amounts of time. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of that would be really beneficial.
And what I say frequently is it just is weird to me that we're using the podcast host as the ad server. Like they shouldn't be one and the same. They should be different. And if you had like a true ad server, then the ad server would be more motivated to create ad serving tools like frequency capping and better geo-targeting options and you could like I don't know, I would presume that you would have the ability to bring in things like that, right? It would just
Mhm.
be really great, in my opinion, if we had like a true ad server. When we think about all the different pixel tracking companies, you are the person on our team that implements those pixels. What would you say are some of the important things to look at when it comes to using those measurement tools?
I think they can be beneficial in so many different ways. And I'll use Spotify ad analytics as an example because that's one that we use often. And so some things that are really important to look at, obviously purchase events. So you can see how many purchases are being made directly from advertisements that the show has aired and the value of those purchases. I think that's amazing to just have right
Mhm.
off the bat. Especially if you do have a promotion and a promo code that is identical to what you might have on your website,
Yeah.
right? That's a great way to really see truly what the performance is looking like, just like regardless of what a promo code is for a show.
Mhm.
The other thing I think is really important is so most of the tracking platforms will show you the impressions that have been delivered from a show, but they'll also show household frequency and they'll show conversion rates. So I'll talk about conversion rates first. You can see the total impressions that are being delivered, but then the conversion rates are breaking it down to show you how many households are being reached. Obviously, one household is probably going to be reached with your advertisement multiple times,
Mhm.
and you can get a better feel for that with attribution tracking. And then that goes into household frequency, which is just basically showing a percentage of that number. I think that can really help, especially when you have multiple shows on a campaign and they are
Mhm.
all different sizes. You could have a
Mhm.
show that's delivering 500,000 impressions a month and you could have one that's delivering 10,000 impressions a month. There's so many different factors that go into performance like unique listeners and how often shows are publishing and things like that. So I think that looking at those household uniques are very important.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And I think that when we talk about frequency, that's the piece that I really believe is the important piece. And getting back to your other point, if we were able to better frequency cap and predict delivery, all of that would be super helpful in terms of actually executing on the campaigns.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, thank you so much for being on the show today. If you had, I guess, one piece of advice that you would want to communicate to advertisers, what would that be? Is there something that sticks out in your mind as a piece of advice that maybe somebody entering the podcast ad space should know?
That's a great question. I would say just be open to change, be open to testing different shows and trying new things and maybe testing shows that you wouldn't expect to maybe fit your brand. I think that's the biggest thing is really just staying open-minded and being willing to work things in order to really benefit from a campaign as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree. That really just that ability to test and see what's
Mhm.
working. And there can be so many different layers to that, right? It could be the genre, it could be the demographic, it could be the audience size, it could be like we've been talking about, maybe the unique listeners, it could be the even the number of days that that particular podcast drops in a week, but being open and then measuring the results and then iterating on those results, I think is where you get to success.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I think we covered some really fun things in this episode that we don't talk about very often. So please take some of it to heart and apply it where you can. And if you haven't had a chance to check out our YouTube channel, head on over to YouTube and look at the videos that we're creating there for you. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.